The Diablo 4 community is tearing itself apart right now. And I just really want to focus in on one of these big nerfs that they're doing and kind of figure out if it makes any sense at all. So they've said that they are seeing critical strike damage and vulnerable damage often viewed as a hard requirement for a build success in Diablo 4. We believe that this is a step towards allowing more builds to flourish and will continue to make changes in support of this goal. And so in order to make it so that critical strike damage and vulnerable damage weren't as much of a hard requirement, what they did is they just reduced the numbers. So critical strike damage went down on gear by 17%, then vulnerable damage went down by 40%. Now, does this actually help me want to pick other stats? Like if I'm comparing this mace, for example, with one of my current swords, how do I compare and contrast these two? Well, first off, I have a little spreadsheet tool here that goes through and does all the calculations for me so I can know exactly which one of these is better and which one of these is worse. But before we go into that, let's talk about damage buckets. So on a one-handed weapon for a barb, there are 4 different damage buckets that stats fall into. There is stats, so like main stat, all stat kind of both fall in there. You have vulnerable damage, you have crit strike damage, and then you have everything else. So damage with basic skills, damage versus injured, damage versus close, distant, stun, slowed, core, dot, wall berserking, versus crowd controlled or versus bleeding enemies. All of that falls in the same bucket. And so the reason why making it so that you get less vuln damage on your gear doesn't matter is because it's in a different bucket than the rest of these. And since all of these are in the same bucket, getting more of these makes getting even more of it kind of worse in a way. And there's so little vulnerable damage right now from other sources that it kind of still is mandatory to get it from gear. And I think that that is really stupid and that's something that they can fix. And I have a couple of different solutions for them. So first off, you might notice that I have 2 calculators in the background here. Well, number one on the left is the current one. I'll put a link to this in the description. This is kind of just how it works in terms of the buckets and it calculates on that. The one on the right over here is going to be based off of if they actually did damage buckets the way we thought they were going to do them before the launch. And so the way we thought that they were going to be doing these, where they would have main stat, vuln, crit, and all of the others would also have more buckets. So you'd have things like damage with, so like damage with basic, damage with core, damage with physical, stuff like that. You'd have versus, so like versus injured, versus close, versus distant, versus stunned, slowed, crowd controlled, versus bleeding enemies, and then while, so like while healthy, while berserking, while fortified, all of that stuff. Except they didn't do it this way. And so if we go through and we just look at this, so right now I'm going to pretend that my new weapon is going to have 78 main stat. We can see that for the boss difference here, we're seeing about a 3.63% increase, which is the same thing on if they had more buckets. If we go for it and go for the max vuln damage roll, which is 21%, 5.25 to 5.25, exactly the same. Having the more buckets wouldn't necessarily change the value of these. If we look at crit strike damage, we can see that they're exactly the same. And so adding more buckets wouldn't necessarily make any of these damage sources worse. However, it would make the next damage sources better. So all of these right in here, damage first, damage while, damage with, all of these are in their own giant bucket. And so if I was going to get 35.3% close damage, this would be 3.9% more damage for me right now. While if there were multiple buckets, that would be 12% more damage for me if, damage versus type was in its own bucket. Because right now, I don't really have a lot of damage versus. I have just this close damage. So getting a little bit more of it is a big increase for me. And then likewise, all of these other ones like damage with basic skills is a large increase. I do have more with, but this would give us more options if you had 2 damage bucket types of things, or if you have more damage buckets than just the versus while and with were all in the same thing. And I'll put a copy of this sheet as well in the description below so you can mess around with your stats and see how things would be different. But I went through and I rated all of the skills that all of the stats that you can get on a one-handed weapon based off their increase on the old system and then on the more bucket system. And we can kind of see that there is not very much different in the top buckets, but down here, all of the ones that are in these like giant bucket all become better once they're spread out. And so right now, my top 4 in the current system is still vulnerable damage, followed by close, followed by main stat, and crit damage. And then in the new system, it would be close damage by a lot, while berserking versus bleed, and then vulnerable damage. And I just think this is pretty insane. It's pretty insane to me that vulnerable damage is still my number 1, even though I have 300% vulnerable damage. And so if I had less vulnerable damage, if I wasn't playing a barbarian, I was playing a sorc or a necro or a druid, I would have a lot less vulnerable damage, which means vulnerable would be even more important, which makes this entire system very silly. So like, for example, rolling this back real quick, looking at just the vulnerable damage, it was at 5.25%. If I had half of the vulnerable damage I do now, it becomes even more powerful. So even though that they've tried to take the power away from vulnerable, this isn't working because you still get so much power from it from gear because there's so little vulnerable damage anywhere else. And they shot themselves in their own foot with this in the very beginning because they actually patched out vulnerable damage in the very beginning of the game. Most of you guys probably didn't have to deal with this, but like one of the very first patches to the game, all glyph bonus scaling has been reduced by 34%, with the exception of the following. Vulnerable glyphs bonus reduced by 66%. 66%. And so what this means is that this exploit glyph that everyone is using used to be like 3 times larger. So at full blown out value, this was giving you like over 100% vulnerable damage. Barbarians basically had 80 vulnerable damage ripped away from them. And that might not seem like that big of a deal, except if you remember, the bigger this number is on the left-hand side, the less impactful adding more of it's going to be. So if we make this 380 as opposed to 300, the amount that getting it on gear goes down in terms of like how valuable that is. So currently for my gear, I have 147% vulnerable coming from gear, 88.9% coming from Paragon, 38.8% coming from Glyph, and then 20% base. So if you really want players to not be reliant on vulnerable and crit strike damage, and you still want vulnerable to be in the game, because probably the best fix to make it so that vulnerable isn't mandatory, the only real fix will be to remove it, because it is a multiplier. It, at baseline, even without having any vulnerable anywhere in your gear, if you took away all vulnerable stat from all gear, all Paragon, all glyphs, having vulnerable in the target would still give you 20% more damage. That's like getting a free affix, or free aspect. And so you're obviously going to want that. But since it can get so freaking big, you really need to have it in every build. And some builds are really bad at applying it. So, and other builds are really good at applying it. So vulnerable just feels super just railroaded into every build. And so my number one fix would be just 100% get rid of it. My number two fix would be increase this base amount by a lot. Take it from being 20%, make it 100%, and make more builds have easier access to this. And you can continue to remove it from gear if you want, and you could restore the glyph to be back to where it was before, and it would be fine. It would be totally fine, because if you don't want people picking vulnerable here on their gear, you need to give them more vulnerable other places. Now, I do agree that having like vulnerable give you so much damage is really ridiculous. So yeah, Another thing they could do is just make it so that there are more buckets so that other stats become more valuable at a faster pace because you want to spread out your total stats. Like I said, right now, my top 4 stats, if we had multiple buckets for things like while, versus, and with, my number 1 stat would become close damage. My number 2 would be a while berserking stat. And my number 3 would be a versus bleeding enemy stat. And then number 4 would be vulnerable. And yes, doing like injured damage would be like even better. But I don't really count this since it is not up all the time. But even this injured damage, if it's only up a third of the time, would still be beating vulnerable. So I don't think that just reducing the stats on gear is the way to go. You need to like either completely rework it or rework your damage model or something. But hopefully this helps out. If you want to check out these sheets in the description below, yeah, they can help you out, figure out what is better gear for season 1. And hopefully you guys have a great time. We'll see you again soon. Peace.